Today I'm doing part 2 of a Q&A series generated on previous videos I've done here on my Ram 3500 dually long bed. Now, like I said, this is part 2, so if you didn't catch last week's video, part 1, definitely be sure to catch up on that first. And if you haven't seen the full build video that I did here on my truck, or even the air suspension, the Payload demo video, definitely check those videos out as well, as they do give context to today's part 2. So I'll put cards up above and links for those in the description below. All right, so with that said, today I'm going to discuss the feedback and questions generated from the previous recommendations that I mentioned in my build video, where I talked about how if I had known what I know today, back say 10 years ago, then it would have saved me the expense of at least 2 or 3 trucks and probably a ton of money in the process, obviously. So I presented those recommendations on what kind of truck I think you should buy, really based on the weight of the RV or trailer, for that matter, that you plan to tow or buy. And specifically, I talked about one very popular class of truck that I would strongly discourage against purchasing. And I believe I said previously it's pretty much a waste, in my opinion, or something along those lines. Well, of course, that generated a lot of feedback in the comments with folks that disagreed with me, but more importantly, there were some points made in the comments that I think are kind of misleading, especially if you're new to heavy-duty trucks. And so my goal in this part 2 video is going to be highlighting some of those points to add some clarity. And in case you didn't catch my recommendations previously, I'll just revisit them real quickly to make sure that we're all on the same page. And as I mentioned before, my recommendations, they have a lot to do with understanding the payload capacity in relation to towing. You know, it's one of those things that really both car dealers and RV dealerships, they don't spend a lot of time talking about. They tend to focus just on the big towing numbers that a truck can do. And those can be a little bit misleading, really. And then the other thing to point out is RV manufacturers, they post pin weights and tongue weights on their models, but they're based on units without options typically. And of course, unloaded, you know, without all your personal belongings inside. And so consider this: by the time you add options to an RV, and I'm talking about factory or aftermarket options, and then you add in all your personal belongings, your pin weight, your tongue weight, it might go up some 35%, as in the case of my Jayco Pinnacle back here. And so that's really what's driving all these recommendations. I'm categorizing, you know, how much you should purchase, what kind of truck you should purchase based on how much you're going to be towing. And there's going to be some overlap here, you'll see. And of course, these recommendations go for all the different brands. All right, so first category is going to be if you're towing up to 7,000 pounds, and this is probably going to be a travel trailer. I'd recommend a half-ton gasser truck, any bed size, all day long. Next category, if you're going to be towing 6,000 to 14,000 pounds, that could be a travel trailer or a fifth wheel. And you notice this one's a pretty big range. But for this one, I'd recommend a 3/4 ton gasser truck, and that could be a short or long bed. Then if you're going to be towing 10,000 to 15,000 pounds, this is where I'd recommend a 1-ton single rear wheel diesel, and that could be a short or long bed truck again. And then last category, if you're going to be towing 14,000 pounds or more, that's where I'm going to recommend a 1-ton dually long bed with the high output diesel or the highest axle ratio, depending on what brand of truck. All right, so like I said, you're probably noticing that there's a very popular class of truck and engine combination that is completely missing from my recommendations, and that is the 3/4 ton truck with a diesel engine. Now, these are extremely popular on dealer lots, but in my opinion, if you plan to do any serious towing, you know, especially with an RV, you should skip the 3/4 ton diesel and instead go straight to the 1-ton single rear wheel diesel truck. You know, personally, I really don't see the practical use for a 3/4 ton diesel if you're going to be towing regularly. You know, I think they're a complete waste. And again, that's just my subjective opinion. And the reason is the payload on the 3/4 ton diesels, it's severely limited, especially on the trucks that are configured with options. You know, typically you're going to be left with a payload in the 2 to 2,500 pound range with all the extra weight of that diesel engine up front. which again, really it's just a waste in my opinion, as you can't tow much with it in the end since you run out of payload. Remember, payload is not just the pin weight or the tongue weight of your RV, your trailer, how much that weighs up front, but it's also your passengers and then any other gear that goes in your truck inside or in the back of the bed. So as I said previously, the only time I think a 3/4 ton truck makes sense is if you're looking at a gasser 3/4 ton, because then typically your payload, it's going to be north of 3,000 pounds, maybe even up to 3,500 pounds. And again, that all has to do with the weight difference between a gas engine versus the diesel engine. In fact, if you're on the fence whether to buy a 1/2 ton or 3/4 ton gasser, I would absolutely do the 3/4 ton gasser all day long. I think that truck is a super practical truck. It's very useful for a lot of situations. And you know, with all the new transmissions and gas engines out there, such as the Ford, the 7.3 liter Godzilla with the 10-speed, you know, I've heard so many good things about that combination from folks that actually tow north of 13,000 pounds. And so, you know, technology has come a really long way where gas engines are getting better and better and better. And I mean, sure, they're not equal to the experience that you're going to get with a diesel engine, right? But I would double down on the recommendation to get a 3/4 ton gasser. It's probably one of the most versatile trucks out there. And like I said, on that note, I got a ton of comments and feedback on my build video concerning the omission of the 3/4 ton diesel truck. I mean, some folks said the only difference between a 3/4 ton and 1 ton truck is the suspension. So if you have a 3/4 ton truck, it has the same capabilities as a 1 ton truck essentially. Well, folks, I do not agree with that. Consider this: does suspension impact your towing? And yes, it does impact your towing. It impacts the squat. It impacts your steering, right? If you're squatting on the back, then your steering's not going to be as smooth and controllable, right? And so it does impact towing, and it does make a difference when you're towing. Then others noted and said 1 ton trucks are too stiff for daily drivers. And folks, I'm not sure if I'm just used to it, but this is my second dually, the Ram here. I had a Chevy 3500 previously, and now this Ram, of course. And I don't mind them at all. In fact, I think the ride is pretty smooth considering how big and heavy the truck is. In fact, I would not describe it as rough or unbearable. I mean, it's certainly firmer than the coil sprung 2500 that I had back in 2016, the 3/4 ton. But I would absolutely disagree with folks that say the ride of a 1 ton truck is unbearable and too rough. Now, I talked more about that in last week's video in part 1, you know, with the air suspension and the payload section, but I'll just say it again. I think modern trucks have made so many advances, and one of them is the ride quality. I mean, I think they've come such a long way, such that 1 ton dualies, they ride pretty smooth considering all things. Sure, it's not going to be as smooth as a 1/2 ton truck or a 3/4 ton that's got coils in the back, but I would never, and again I'll say it, I would never describe my 1 ton dually as being unbearable concerning the ride quality. And again, I'm using it pretty much as a daily driver. Now, maybe I'm just used to it. It is my subjective opinion in the end, but I think the ride quality is just fine. I'm completely okay with it, you know, especially with the long wheelbase and then the air suspension on the rear, having the 4 pack of leaf springs versus the 6 on the units that don't have it. I think it rides pretty smooth, and I'm okay with that. Now, others commented, and this is the more important one, they said a 3/4 ton truck is capable of towing just as much as a 1 ton truck. It's just a thing on paper due to the gross vehicle weight rating classes and the government, right? And I think you certainly could argue that route. I mean, aside from squat, the suspension differences that we already talked about, they are very similar, if not identical in many respects. But folks, at the end of the day, the truck has a gross vehicle weight rating and a gross combined weight rating. If you're over, you're over. And I'm not trying to be the weight police here, but if you get pulled over by law enforcement, now here in Georgia, I see it happen all the time with commercial vehicles along the interstate with safety patrol deputies. It's probably very unlikely that they're going to ever pull you know, a personal truck over towing an RV, right? So very unlikely, but what if they did? Do you think that law enforcement is going to give you a pass if you're overweight, especially if you're overweight by a substantial amount and you're squatting? I mean, do you think the law enforcement officer is going to say, oh, well, I see you've got a 3/4 ton truck there. Really, that's the same thing, you know, as a 1 ton truck. So my bad, let me rip up this violation or this ticket, right? And I'm being a little sarcastic there. But then here's a more serious thought. Think about this. What if you're involved in a collision and you're over the gross vehicle weight rating of your truck? Is that going to cause a problem? Think about that. What if there's a fatality involved? Are you going to have a clean conscience knowing that you were driving your truck over the gross vehicle weight rating? And furthermore, how would that play out if charges were pressed, right? Vehicular manslaughter or something else? I mean, do you think pulling a heavy RV and being over your gross vehicle weight rating, your gross combined weight rating, is that going to be overlooked? And then think about this. Is your insurance company going to take your side when you're involved in a collision, at fault or not, but you're over the gross vehicle weight rating of your truck? I mean, is the insurance company ultimately going to back you up? Are they going to defend your actions, right? In all these cases, probably not. In fact, I'd venture to guess that accident attorneys, you know, you see their billboards all across the interstate. I'd guess that they, or even state prosecutors for that matter, they're probably going to go after you, especially if a fatality is involved, right? Once they discover that you're over the weight limit, especially if it's more than just a couple 100 pounds. And so all that to say, you've got to think about those situations and what you feel comfortable with in the end. Again, I'm not trying to be the weight police, but, you know, let your conscience be informed and dictate that decision in the end. And I mean, that's what ultimately led me to upgrade to a 1 ton dually, even though at the time I had a lighter fifth wheel years ago and didn't really need a dually. But man, am I glad I did, is I wouldn't be able to tow my Pinnacle if I didn't have a dually. So those are my thoughts on why I don't like 3/4 ton diesels. I mean, if you're gonna get a diesel truck, I say go straight for the 1 ton diesel. And you know, you don't necessarily need a dually. Most brands offer a 1 ton truck in a single rear wheel configuration, even with a short bed if you're concerned about the length there. But you're going to get vastly more payload capacity in that 1 ton truck, even with single rear wheels, compared to the same truck in a 3/4 ton model. So definitely recommend doing the 1 ton truck regardless if you want to go diesel. And then of course, as I mentioned before, if you're towing heavy, you know, over 14,000 pounds, then really I think that's where it makes sense to get the dually and have that extra stability with the width in the back. You know, then the payload numbers, they're going to be typically north of 5,000 pounds by the time you factor in all the options and stuff on the truck. So if you've got a big fifth wheel, over 14,000 pounds, then a dually is definitely the way to go. So in the end, I will stick by my recommendations from the previous video. I would not buy a 3/4 ton diesel, especially if you plan to tow. Now maybe there's a unique situation where you just want that diesel towing experience and you have an extremely light trailer, right? Then sure, that's perfectly fine. But for most of us that are towing RVs, the 1 ton single rear wheel diesel is going to be the best upgrade if you're coming from a 1/2 ton or 3/4 ton gasser, right? Now some might say dealer lots, they don't seem to carry a lot of 1 ton diesel single rear wheel trucks, whether short or long bed. And to that, I'd say special order one. It's completely worth it. You know, this truck here was my first special order ever. And I can say after a year later, it's still the perfect truck for me. So it's definitely worth it to special order. And that way you get exactly what you want and nothing more, nothing less. Well, folks, those are my thoughts, my humble opinion. But I'd love to hear from you. Do you agree or disagree? Definitely let me know in the comments below. Let's get that dialogue going. But hey, just remember to be respectful to everyone, even if you disagree with them. Because hey, at the end of the day, it's just a truck, and it too will turn to dust. Well, as always, thanks for watching.